Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I was like, I'm from the South, and so that's not rhetorical, but good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to have you join us for our session, Expanding the Canon in Higher Education. I'm your moderator for this session, for this panel, Fredara Hadley, ethnomusicology professor at the Juilliard School. And I'm delighted to be joined by three wonderful colleagues: Charles Lwanga, assistant professor of music theory and ethnomusicology at the University of Michigan. Who do we have next? Liana Valente, I didn't see the order. Dr. Liana Valente, voice professor and program coordinator for Shared Voices, an initiative of the Denise Graves Foundation. And Dr. Bill Quillen, dean of the Oberlin Conservatory, and you'll hear from them shortly. As we know, since 2000, calls have increased to reconsider not just the representation in our canon of music, but also how we build that canon in educational specialties. It's out of that inquiry of how our education, our music education, our School of Music and Conservatory education should affirm these desires that this panel, this idea for this panel, was created. As I prepared for today's session, I held in my mind the life and contributions of musician, educator, and composer Wendell Logan. Dr. Logan, a fellow graduate of my alma mater, Florida A&M University, established one of the first jazz studies programs at a conservatory when he founded the jazz studies program at Oberlin Conservatory in the early 1970s. But just as important as that, and maybe even more so, was his famed two-semester course in African American music, affectionately known as the Wendell Logan course. It is this course that brought me to Oberlin to begin my teaching career in 2013. And over the years, I've met generations of his students, including composer Courtney Bryan, opera legend Denise Graves, jazz trumpeter Theo Croker, conductor James Blanchie, acclaimed scholar Alicia Lola Jones, who continue to praise Dr. Logan, his pioneering course, and how it expanded and deepened their own musical horizons, and that the knowledge gained in his course continues to inform their artistry and scholarship today. I mentioned Dr. Logan because his work reminds me of what's possible and what is necessary in higher education. What's necessary? My doctoral student, composer Ivan Rodriguez, is completing his DMA at Juilliard this semester, and in his dissertation, which focuses on white hegemony in American orchestral programming, he interviews musicians, conductors, orchestra managers who explain that part of the resistance they encounter is due to unfamiliarity of engaging musical material that seems outside of what their conservatory education prepared them for. The degree to which this is true varies, but it does raise the question: what kind of world are our conservatories and schools of music preparing students for? And what are we doing well, and what needs continual improvement? This is the heart of today's conversation. And with that, we are fortunate to have an ideal panel for this conversation: a music theorist who is also an ethnomusicologist, a conservatory dean, and a voice professor who has taught at both HBCUs and PWIs, and now works in innovative ways to bridge those histories and worlds together. I'd like to start with each panelist saying hello and giving any opening remarks they'd like to share. I'll start with you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Lwanga. I'm originally from Uganda, and I'm now working at the University of Michigan. I am both, as you heard, a music theorist. I hold a doctorate degree in music composition and theory, and a second doctorate degree in ethnomusicology as well. And so I think I am in a very, very good position really to speak from a very authoritative, kind of perspective, especially when it comes to expanding the canon. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone, and I promise not to touch that mic again. I'm Liana Valente. I use the pronoun she, hers. For 30 years, I have been teaching in higher education at PWIs, HBCUs. My last position was at Howard University, HU.
Hey.
And now I work for the incomparable Denise Graves, running her Shared Voices program, which allows me to continue to work with collegiate, aged, outstanding classical vocalists and with colleagues at Oberlin and Juilliard to talk about this very idea of how to expand the canon so that it is inclusive and we are no longer just avoiding and not even considering the outstanding music written by Black and African American composers, their performances. So this was a great transition for me from higher education to the Denise Graves Foundation. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you again, Dr. Hadley, for inviting me.
Of course, welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Quillen. I use he, him. I'm Dean of the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. It is a great, great pleasure to be here today. It's wonderful to be reunited with many dear friends and colleagues and former students, and also with new friends, so it's a great pleasure. I too have been greatly looking forward to this conversation for numerous reasons, including just one very tiny element to some of the through lines I'm sure that will be emergent today, reflecting on some of what Fredara was saying apropos Dr. Logan and his incomparable legacy and contributions, and also the work of the Shared Voices Foundation, many other things. I think of just an institution such as Oberlin, which is almost in a microcosm, some of the themes that we're exploring today. It's a PWI in a very rural part of a Midwestern state, and yet it's a PWI whose one of its greatest, if not its greatest legacies, is this history of African American composers, creators, musicians, institution builders, primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but not only, who are Oberlin alumni. And yet this history is not something of which there's necessarily always been much awareness at Oberlin, or at least mainstream at Oberlin. And so that's just one tiny microcut where even in your own backyard, when we talk about expanding the canons, look over your left shoulder and look at some of your alums, and yet it's practically unknown. And so anyhow, looking forward to a rich conversation. So thank you, Fredara.
Absolutely, welcome as well. Charles, I actually want to come back to you, our theorist and ethnomusicologist, for your expertise in those fields, but also you are from Uganda. You represent the beautiful country of Uganda in your research and in your life. And you have brought an innovative approach to teaching theory at the University of Michigan that you think is important to sort of even the playing field of how we think about music more broadly. If you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm very, very grateful for my Dean Gear of the School of Music, Theater, Dance at the University of Michigan, and my colleagues. These colleagues of mine are very open-minded. So even though I was employed as an ethnomusicologist, they also gave me the liberty to teach, innovative courses that I felt would add onto what was already there in the school. So one of the courses I introduced was actually the theory and analysis of non-Western or world musics, for that matter. And this is where, for me, I saw an opportunity to expand the canon. How so? By actually including in my syllabus some of the very, very important works, like William Steele, Grant, and many others, and we even problematized the very notion of the canon itself and deconstructed it completely. So we start by deconstructing it, and the class is both graduate students and upper-level undergraduate students. So we completely deconstruct the canon, not to mean historically what it meant, but rather to open doors to include even multiple musics or musical styles that were underlooked upon historically as, being of probably a much lower class, So in this syllabus, we even include hip-hop. And we bring to the study multiple analytical approaches that have been developed even by Black scholars and musicians. Like, for instance, the polyrhythmic block analysis. Dean Bill, when I was invited one time to give a talk, again, thanks to Dr. Fredara at the conservatory, your conservatory, I had an opportunity of introducing that analytical tool, which was imperative in introducing the interplay, the significance of rhythm to the construction of structure in a song. It's very important. So, in as much as we may be looking at or listening to Kendrick Lamar, say, think about one of the songs and its repetitive nature, we couldn't probably start off by dismissing the repetitive sensibility of the piece. But rather, we take a very careful listen and ask a very important question. What is happening musically beyond actually the text? There is usually a lot of material to discover down there. So don't rush at all to dismiss off such musical styles because of their repetitive nature. And this is one of the things earlier scholars, the likes of Reverend Jones and many others, fell into. It was the trap that they fell into when they came to study even the music in Africa itself. And they dismissed its complexity, its worthiness, for instance, of study within the canon, premised upon the idea that, probably there wasn't that much beyond, the rhythmic nuances. And we're now saying, take a look. Go slow, as Kofi Agawo has advocated, There is something there that takes place. But only if you open up your eyes and the ears to that is only when you discover, the intellectual capabilities of these intellectuals, these black or even, composers, and musicians that we study in the class. So for me, I have had this environment that has been very supportive, and students have been right, on top of the class. The class is very interesting for them because they feel the canon is now getting expanded and they are learning something out of what has historically been viewed as, the only thing that is capable of being learned or schooled about in a music school setting. So, theory and analysis of world musics, even though the term itself is problematic, but I saw that it was an opportune moment for me to sneak in multiple musical styles, and of course deconstructing the canon, even to include popular musical styles, and multiple other analytical tools. We, for instance, use the sonic visualizer. If you may talk about, for instance, analyzing the blues melodic material, for instance, that William Grant employs in his, symphony, first movement, we could use the sonic visualizer to locate, the intricacies of timbre. This was a composer of intellect who knew orchestration and knew how to write actually music in a very intellectual perspective. And from such a composition, you also look at the contribution of music, or in the absence of text, in articulating identity, issues that are imperative in what we study in the academy. Thank you for now.
Thank you. So many different directions we could go from your robust answer. Two things I'm thinking about, though, is the work of composer, educator, and theorist Undine Smith-Moore, who was at Virginia State for a very long time and actually wrote a theory textbook that remained unpublished and was thinking about a lot of these ideas of developing analytical tools that more accurately reflects the complexity of what may seem repetitive, but really cataloging musical events in a really important way and encouraging her students to think about them. The other thing I was thinking about is you said that part of what made all of this possible was support from the dean and administrative support. And so, Bill, I'm thinking about your work and your position as dean of Oberlin Conservatory, the oldest continuously open conservatory in the country. And you gave us a little bit of the history, the really important history of Oberlin and its connection with Black composers and musicians and educators, as Lulu Vera Childers was the founder of the School of Music at Howard University, Dr. Valente's beloved Howard University. And so if you could talk a bit more about how you've seen your role as Dean of Oberlin Conservatory and these questions that we're raising today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fredara. It's a great question. In many regards, so I became dean, just for a little bit of positionality. I became dean in 2020. I became acting dean in 2019. I came to Oberlin in 2017. And a lot of these conversations, of course, and a lot of this work have been going on, I mean, frankly, probably since the inception of the school, I think it's fair to say. Oberlin was founded in 1833, the conservatory in 1865, and it was the first institution, it was among the first institutions, I should say, to not only admit women, but also to adopt a race-blind admissions policy. So it has this very rich and long legacy. And as Fredara said, thanks to the work of decades and decades and decades of work by individuals such as Dr. Logan and many others, it has this element in its institutional fabric about this sort of progressive cause and all. That having been said, it's also a very complex story, and the narrative, which oftentimes tells the story, is a very simple, one-way, unidirectional narrative that everyone cheers, is, let's just say, it's a little bit more complex than that. Even the vote by the trustees historically, I'm talking 19th century vote, to adopt a race-blind admissions policy was not exactly let's just say it wasn't exactly unanimous, et cetera, et cetera. But talking about that and engaging with that is a fundamental part of the story and the work. So I'd say my time at Oberlin really started with our current president. I came to Oberlin the same time she did, President Ambar, and she's just extraordinary. And of course, it's also been a time when my time in the dean's role has overlapped with a lot of significant events, such as the pandemic, such as the intensification of a lot of the conversations around social and racial justice after the summer of 2020 and so on. I'm very fortunate in that I stepped into a situation where there were extraordinary faculty and staff colleagues who were dedicated to these conversations, this work, this transformation in a very, very, very rich and robust way. I mean, I think here first and foremost of our dear colleague, Chris Jenkins, who's Associate Dean at Oberlin, who has been really a leading light, not just in our institution, but really I think the field. Chris, not to embarrass Chris too much, Chris, if you're listening on the web stream, hello. But Chris published a book that is really a sort of concentration of his ideas, and for me is really a guiding theoretical framework for approaching a lot of this work. Chris calls upon us all, and I'll say once again, I mean, for me, Chris's framework, I think, is a tremendously inspirational one as we think about this. In Chris's argument, there's an imperative not merely to, enhance compositional diversity within the framework and the structures as they're presently constituted. Of course that's good, and of course that's right. But also, and much more fundamentally, to interrogate those structures themselves, to dramatically expand the cultural aperture of our institutions and of our sector, to interrogate and expand the forms of knowledge production and cultural production that are considered legitimate in conservatories in the first place. So yes, we want to expand the canon, but we also want to interrogate the whole notion of canonicity, and not just in terms of a set of works, but even in terms of genres and forms of musicking and knowledge production and so on and so forth. And so that, all that's a long way of saying, I'm surrounded by people like Chris, and that goes a very, very, very long way, and I have a president who is likewise extraordinarily supportive. My view with a lot of, I was actually thinking on the drive up from Oberlin this morning, I mean, in panel discussions like this, this is terribly reductive and terribly simplistic, and I'm suggesting a binarism doesn't really exist, but there's the sort of, what are we going to do, but then the how are we going to do it? And the what, it is, expanding the creators from historically marginalized communities, et cetera, which is great. But then the how do we do it in a way that it's not just a one-hit wonder, that it's not just linked to one particular charismatic individual, that if they leave, it falls apart? How do we make it so it's not just, it's February, played some more, expect our regularly scheduled programming, and so on and so forth. And in my view, just echoing something Dr. Charles said, I mean, having having faculty members who are committed to this in a genuine way is just key. I mean, in my view, without the faculty, because they're the ones at the end of the day who are teaching this, who are making many of the decisions. And this isn't, I'm not abdicating my role as dean, not at all. It's a both and. You know, we send signals about the kinds of people we hope to hire. We make decisions about the flows of resources. We help set up what sorts of modes of production professionally are rewarded or encouraged or allowed. So that's a lot that the administration does, and then we also work to get the right kind of faculty in the room to set the tone, set the climate, to make the kinds of decisions about you know, repertoire and programming, these day-to-day decisions. And so it's, you know, and then also, I mean, I was reflecting on the drive up too. I mean, some of the most transformative work I think that's taken place at our institution has come not only directly from within, but has come through partnerships. For example, a partnership with the Denise Graves Foundation, where that has been an absolutely transformative vector into our school, where we have a core group of students and staff and faculty who are partnering in this multi-year process, this multi-year transformative journey, and because of that, we're able to bring it back into the core institution. And we've seen this discernible change in recital programming, masterclass things that used to be the sort of unmarked kind of, you know, or that used to be the sort of marked, you know, like, here, we got to do something different. Now we're just normal. They're just normal. Long may it last. But it's again, not to repeat myself, I think having that interplay of administrative support and signaling, faculty leadership buy-in, those two parts are really kind of key, I think, if it's not going to be the one-hit wonder, but really built into the fabric.
Thank you. And so you know I'm coming to you next.
If you don't mind, let me just say something to Bill, because I am just thrilled to hear that after a year and a half of shared voices at Oberlin, that we're already making the kind of substantive changes that we had hoped to do through the foundation. So that warms my heart. So I am so glad to hear that from you. I hear it from the students all the time, that they now have the opportunity to explore this music that is so important to them that maybe they didn't know about. So I am excited by that. And another thing that you said about the administration has to be committed to this kind of change, because we all know there are some administrators who are not. And so the faculty members, we have our ways of bringing this literature to our students, to our colleagues. I think there are attachments in the app for today's panel. I'm a vocalist. I was the coordinator of classical voice at Howard University, so those all come from me. But I think the important thing is, if you want to make that change, you need to know the resources. And even if a book was published 50 years ago by Patterson, you might not know about it. So I share those resources with you. That's just the tip of the iceberg for any who are interested in just starting to explore the art song and the spiritual arrangements by African American and Black composers, women composers. And what I wanted to say is that at the HBCUs, we do this all the time. This literature is interwoven in every class that you take, whether it's diction or song lit or theory or your orchestra or your band. And that's part of the beauty of being at the HBCU, because yes, you're learning Mozart and Bach and Beethoven, but you're also learning Undine Smith Moore, Florence Price, William Grant Still. And it's not as an afterthought or, oh, look, it's African American History Month. No, we don't celebrate Black History Month. Every day is a celebration. And that is something that we are able to share with our colleagues at our predominantly white institutions who know that there's something lacking, but maybe don't know how to do it well and do it with the care and consideration that it deserves. Again, not just slapping together a program in February. So I'm thrilled to work with my colleagues here and all of my colleagues through the Shared Voices program, because we're all learning from each other. When I was teaching at Howard, I was teaching the diction class. So you learn English diction and you learn through repertoire. Well, of course, one of our repertoire was Cecil Cohen's Death of an Old Seaman. It has a manageable range for any singer. Well, almost. My poor tenors didn't have the bottom notes. But they were given the choice. You can sing this Aaron Copland arrangement, or you can sing the Cecil Cohen. And just gave them the choice, not, this is a black composer, you must sing this composer. But here is a fantastic song with a connection to Howard University, which just made it even more special for them. The song literature Bible that we all use is the Carol Kimball, and the old Carol Kimball had, I believe, one African-American composer, and that was Burleigh. The newer edition maybe has 6, 7, maybe. I most certainly do augment the Carol Kimball book when I teach the song literature, because there is just so much literature. So I've gotten completely off track. Nope. But what goes on at the HBCUs is not, it's magical when you're there, but it's not mystical. We can share this information with our colleagues. How do you bring in, if you're doing harmonic analysis, why are you not analyzing William Grant Still? Why are you not analyzing the Florence Price Piano Concerto? Because that is mind-blowing. And why are you not singing the art songs by these fantastic composers and only allowing your students to sing, well, if you have to, you can sing a spiritual arrangement. The spirituals are fantastic, but that's not the end-all and be-all of what is out there for the classical vocalist. So having these conversations with our colleagues, having conversations with the faculty and with the administrators, because we're not talking about scary radicalization. We're talking about uplifting this beautiful music that has been ignored, that cannot be ignored any longer. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to give a shout out to Dr. Lisa Beckley Roberts, chair of the music department at Jackson State University, who was not, I saw you nodding your head. Dr. Valente, I'm coming, take your sip of water, but I'm coming right back to you because we don't have student representation on this panel, but you work with students. You've taught students for such a long time, but also now in your role as program coordinator with Shared Voices, which is now in its second year, which is amazing. I wondered if you could share a little bit more about what Shared Voices is, but also what you are noticing and hearing from the students who are going through this experience, which is kind of a ground level, innovative way of expanding the canon.
Sure, thank you. I would love to. So the Shared Voices program is one of 3 programs of the Denise Graves Foundation, and the foundation is barely 2 years old, so we are so excited by the successes of everything that we've been able to do so far. There are 3 pillars. There's Shared Voices, which focuses on the collegiate and recently graduated classical vocal artist. We have Generational Voices, which addresses the needs of those singers that are done with school, they've done a couple of young artist programs, but they can't make that leap just yet to a professional career. And then our educational pillar, which is the Hidden Voices, which is our opportunity to bring to light the lives of these outstanding performers, directors, composers, whose lives and accomplishments are unknown. They are virtually ignored, and we are bringing them to light. So the stories about Mary Cardwell Dawson and Sister Rita Jones, Robert McFerrin Sr., we know his son, but we need to know the father as well, McHenry Boatwright. So we take it as part of our mission to be educators, not just to our students, but also to our communities. So with the Shared Voices program, we bring together students from 8 different institutions, 4 HBCUs, 4 conservatories. Oberlin is one of our conservatories, Peabody, the Juilliard School, Manhattan School of Music, Howard University, Fisk University, Morgan State University, and Morehouse. That makes up our first consortium, and we are in our 2nd year. And the thing that has come from all of our students, whether they're at conservatory or at the HBCU, is the aha moment when they realize the art songs and the operas are there, they know how to find them, and I've got to give a shout out to Fredara. She was one of our Industry Day experts last year and showed us how to do the research and how to find the primary sources and the secondary sources to do the research. But they were so excited to learn about this music, and then they share it through their lecture recitals that we curate with them. They share this music with their colleagues at school. They put this music now not just on recitals, but also when they go to competitions. Because the more this music is out there, you know it, the more familiar someone is with a piece, the more they're going to want to hear it. I was speaking with Christina Baker from Young Concert Artists. She said this one particular George Walker song was performed by 15 of the singers that were competed. This one song, because it is getting out there now, and our Shared Voices students, they're cohort members, and they are doing the work, and they love the music, and it becomes part of them. Because of that, their faculties are engaged and excited by this music, which makes it a little easier when you have an administration, not Bill, but when you have an administration that is, concerned, like maybe down in Florida, but you have this opportunity, you see the students excited, that excites and gives license to the faculty, and then the administrators realize, okay, it doesn't matter what that governor says, we're still going to do what we know is right. So the students themselves have been surprised at how much literature there is for all voice types, how accessible it is to sing, and honestly, how accessible it is now to get it. There is a link to Louise Toppin's website, the African Diaspora Music Project. You can't buy scores from there, but she lists thousands of scores, both orchestral and vocal, so at least you can find who the publisher is and then follow that path. So the students themselves, they love the research. They especially appreciate that they are able now to sing this literature, and it's not a one and done. It's part of who they are now, and it's part of what they will continue to sing. So they've become empowered, and that's just really exciting for me.
Thank you. You spoke a lot about the kind of internalization of this, and also the confidence that they can do it. The research is there, and they feel empowered to go ahead and make this just a part of what they do. And so I'm curious for both Dean Quillen and for Dr. Lwanga, how should we think about benchmarks of success? Or how do you gauge whether you're having, through the administrative efforts that you mentioned before, through the classroom efforts that you spoke about, that we are continuing to head in a direction that is fruitful in your mind?
Yeah, in my mind, thank you. This is a very nice question. I first taught this course in the winter of 2021. And the very, very first indicator was the response of the students about the course itself, because in the responses, actually, these students were very explicit about the idea of having more courses of the sort. But then, these responses also end up in the administrators at the end of the day. And so I was surprised. This year, I was about to skip actually teaching that very course until my chair wrote me an email and thought, hey, do you think we really want to have this one again? And to me, that's a very good indicator because, the news is actually moving around, that, again, ingrained within the idea of deconstructing the canon, even problematizing the canon to, to really deconstruct this kind of colonial sentiments that have shaped for a very long time, schools, of music, to really get to be much more inclusive in the idea that multiple different styles genres and even composers within even the classical tradition, regardless of how they look like, are intellectuals, and that their music and compositions are actually worth of the material. I know that there is some, thesis and dissertations, for instance, that have been written about Grant Steele's symphony, doctoral dissertations. I think the latest being 2013. So this is a very good indicator that these works are worthy of study. And so when we hear back from students and then our senior colleagues and administrators themselves calling upon us, rather, to continue offering such courses, I think this is something to let us know that we are heading in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a great question, Fredara. It's, we, of course, monitor all sorts of things. Like many of us in our schools, we take a peek at, let's look at all of our large ensemble program over the last year and how did it kind of shake out in terms of, female identifying composer, non-male identifying composers, BIPOC, and so on and so forth, just to get a sense of what does that look like. So monitoring that, and not that we have there's no specific targets per se, but monitoring it to be aware of it. So there's elements like that. But what I would say too, a couple kind of more localized things is just observing up close the students and what they do with these experiences and where it goes. And I'm reflecting a little bit on, we did performances of The Ordering of Moses by one of our alums, our Nathaniel Dett. We did some performances in Oberlin and then at Carnegie. And the students were so into the piece. I mean, it's a great piece, and they were so into it that they took they took the text and they sort of did a biblical concordance and like finding, they did all this work just on this extra work because they were so inspired by the, little indicators like that's a kind of qualitative indicator of just how enthusiastic about the piece they were and how passionate about the piece that they were. I guess I would sort of say too, and this is as we look what happens to our graduates when they go out in the world. I mean that ultimately I think will be yet another indicator as we think about the success of these kind of curricular changes and their implications. And the reason I say that is that, as I think about a lot of the curricular changes that we've put in place at our institution in terms of, transforming the theory curriculum, transforming the large ensemble curriculum, changing credits to minimize barriers for different kinds of music making, all those sorts of things. Yes, there's an element of these changes that is motivated by ideas of justice and diversity is inherent good. Of course. It's motivated just as much by an idea that we need to foster creative and artistic excellence and intellectual excellence, and that to be a successful artist in the 21st century and beyond, you need to be cognizant of and fluent in much more than just one narrow tradition. And so this is an element of it's emphatically, it's diversity and justice, again, as inherent goods unto themselves, yes. And it just so happens that maps almost 100% with what we need to do just to actually create artistically and creative and intellectually vital spaces for our students, and intellectually vital training grounds for our students, for their thriving as professionals, for the thriving of our art form, the continuation, frankly, of our art form. So both these things come together. I would be doing a disservice, in my view, I speak just as Bill Q individual, I'd be doing a disservice if we maintained a curriculum that was basically 100-year-old set in amber. So that would, transforming is also because I have students to whom I have a moral obligation to provide the most creative and intellectually vibrant space possible for them. And so all these things sort of go together. I guess I would just say too that, I was reflecting a little bit about hearing what our colleagues were saying, talking about the HBCU conservatory interaction. When we did The Ordering of Moses, I remember, Fredara, some of the conversations we had where even the language that we use where, it might be new to us, but it wasn't exactly new. It might be a world premiere in some spaces, but it wasn't exactly a world premiere. It was performed extensively throughout networks of HBCUs. But the reason I say that too is that as we talk about expanding the canon, moving the canon in, finding ways that we're not just sort of like willy-nilly and recklessly charging into cultural spaces and performance practices that have very rich intellectual and creative and artistic traditions and legacies, and just sort of assuming, okay, well, we can do this too, which, we've been fortunate at our school where we have people who can sort of help us position and really thoughtfully approach a performance practice and situate itself. Because there's always that question too. Yes, we want to expand the canon. Yes, we emphatically want to begin including works that hitherto have been excluded. At the same time, we want to do that with a respect, with a respectfulness towards the tradition, intellectual legacies there. And that too is a sort of very interesting set of conversations to explore.
Oh, yeah, that's right, Dean Bill. In fact, in my very classes, at the very beginning of the class, I make it explicitly clear to the students that expanding the canon doesn't mean in any way that we're now saying, now to hell with, I'm so sorry to use that term, with the traditional, history of intellectualism. That's not what we actually do, and we make it explicitly clear to them. In other words, we even draw upon traditional analytical models to understand some of the historically excluded, material, insofar as those analytical models help us to understand and even learn something about these material works. So, not to misunderstand, this very topic we are talking about as, the idea of throwing away now that very rich intellectual history at the expense of that which is being excluded. So we are basically, drawing upon that, and then also bringing in and letting these, materialism speak to each other in ways that are very beneficial. Thank you.
Let me just, we are not throwing out Mozart. If I could sing Mozart the rest of my life, I would. Expanding the canon does not mean excluding the great Schubert, Brahms, Clara Schumann, Amy Beach, but it's to bring in more. We're in the 21st century. There's more than one woman composer. So we're not about excluding, we're about bringing in more and giving us more options and giving our students and our audiences more of the color palette, that is part of who we are.
Yeah, and as we get ready to prepare for Q&A, so if you have questions, start thinking about them, whether you're on the live stream or in the room. I have instructions for you. If you're on the live stream, you need to click the Ask a Question button and type your question, but include the code 42N, the letter N. And if you're in the room and you don't want to come to the mic in a moment to ask your question, you can scan a QR code that, okay, there we go, they're on the screens. You can scan that QR code and you can ask your question that way and still include the code 42N so that we can see it. But I just wanted to respond. You were talking about the Oberlin performance of the Ordering of Moses, and I was fortunately at the performance at Carnegie Hall. And the panel that was a couple days before, maybe the day before, which included wonderful folks like Dr. Roland Carter, who is a dead acolyte and scholar and composer and singer and all of these things in his own right. Having his voice at 80 years old in that conversation, I think, was an example of the kinds of cultural practices we want to bring along with the expansion. And and I'm thinking about your comments about, both of your comments about HBCUs, but is the acknowledgement that classical music has had a home in African American communities for a long time. So right. How do we bring not only the music, but like the ecosystems that supported it in the absence of, the relegation or the ignoring of other conservatories? How do we keep all of those things in tandem as we do it? And I thought that program was so great because you had the Ordering of Moses by Det, an Oberlin alum who has passed away, but you also had Brahms, right, was on that program, and as was, who I mentioned earlier, Ivan Rodriguez in his piece, A Metaphor for Power, who is a young queer Puerto Rican composer. And so I feel like that night kind of encapsulated both where we have been and where we seek to continue to go. So with that, if you have questions, please, you have the online questions.
Yes, I'm Brianna Garcon. I am the engagement liaison, and I will be reading questions submitted online. The very first question submitted by me.
Put yourself at the front of the line, yes.
How can higher education institutions encourage teachers/professors to focus on more diverse repertoire when some of them may not know or even studied it / may not even care?
Let's go with the haven't studied it part. That's where going to conferences, going to conventions, holding panel discussions, that's where this all comes in. And if there is any silver lining to this pandemic that we just endured, it's Zoom. So you can get a panel together from all across the world to talk about these things. So I think it's more of offering the financial support for continuing education for your faculty. Hint, 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 hint. Any administrators who are out there. Professional development should not be a chore. Professional development needs to be an opportunity for your faculty to continue to learn and be engaged and be excited. So we'll go with, they don't know about this literature, so it is upon us to put together panels like this and conferences and discussions, and maybe host one from your school and blast it out to everybody in College Music Society or everybody in MTNA. But give your faculty the time and the money to pursue this kind of study.
Yeah, requirements, of course, can work, but that can also be tricky. Humans oftentimes don't like being told what to do. Faculty, I'm told, are no different.
You don't say.
I don't know.
Funny that.
A couple of dean colleagues in the room, we could huddle up. Maybe that's just my experience. But sometimes requirements can work. One of the challenges with requirements, of course, is finding a one-size-fits-all requirement, and then by the time you carve out enough exceptions, then the whole thing has kind of lost the point. But a lot to be said about that. We for example, we put in place a couple years ago for auditioning students. This is just one tiny example, but for auditioning students, we asked auditioning students a requirement that they include a piece by a. You hear me hemming and hawing because the exact wording changed a little bit, but the gist of it was to include a piece from a historically underrepresented composer, diverse composer. But there were some of our faculty who were trying to think about, well, how do we translate this concept to, for example, international students? What does that mean in that kind of context? So we came up with language that ultimately we felt worked, and it was articulated as an institutional requirement, but it was one that everybody kind of felt a sense of buy-in. But it is. I think sometimes some of those sticks, and then lots and lots and lots of carrots, exactly as Liana said, in terms of professional, and then also getting enough colleagues on the faculty that can create a culture where it is good to do this, and and enough of a cohort that it's not just one voice in the wilderness, but a couple people doing it, and then lo and behold, oh, look at that, I might want to do that too, I might want to do that too. But I really think having enough of that core there to help start to build a culture, and then it can get a little bit of momentum, and then some transformation can start to happen at a little bit bigger scale. Not always.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Tanner. I teach music theory and a variety of other courses at Peru State College in Peru, Nebraska. Dean Quillen, I really resonated with what you were saying about how in amplifying voices that have historically been underrepresented, we're doing real justice to our students who deserve to learn about these composers. And so I was wondering if we could talk maybe a little bit about curricular revision more broadly, and how we make time in the students' degree programs so that we can accommodate all of these composers that need to be learned about.
Yeah. It's a great question. Just two super small examples, I would say, and then I'll zip it and my colleagues. one thing, we completely reinvented our music theory curriculum at Oberlin, and when I say we, the theory faculty did, and we're very fortunate to have extraordinary theory faculty, and they rebuilt the theory curriculum from the ground up, and really changed it from a curriculum that was all about this sort of functionalist, harmonic-centered thing to one that is much more about a phenomenological, experiential approach to music, looking at many, 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 many types of musicking and musical practices, not just Western European art music, but many other types. And so that's really built into the core sequence that's required for all students. So that wasn't, the virtue of that was, it wasn't like, okay, we want to stick with what we've all been doing and then now pile something else on. We changed what we were always doing to sort of build it into there, so that was kind of effective. The other little thing, and this is a tiny, tiny, tiny thing, but we have this extraordinary gospel choir. And we have a lot of classical, which I use in scare quotes, but classical students who wanted to sing in the gospel choir, but it was challenging for them to do so just because of the degree requirements and everything. So we changed the degree requirements so that gospel choir counts for a classical voice ensemble. I mean, that was a tiny, tiny, tiny little change, but that kind of opened up everything. Because a lot of students wanted to do it, but they just literally didn't have room in their schedules or were just too vocally taxed by the time they did their other requirements. So oftentimes it's little tweaks here and there can actually have pretty significant change.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Hi, Joe Lanus. I'm the CEO of the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra in Madison, Wisconsin. And one of the themes in an earlier talk was it takes a team, like a cohesion. On my side, it's the management, it's the musicians, it's the artistic director, the board, but also funding. And I'm very curious, we haven't talked much in this conversation, to what extent, as you think about changing systems, that you think about public funding, your private fundraisers, because there was a team discussion here, and I loved the thought of faculty and administrations working together, but is a funding part of how you think about building these systems in higher education?
Absolutely.
That's a resounding yes. And when you don't have the money to buy paper for your printer, and you cannot replace the stands that are broken and they're put together with duct tape, it's a challenge. And funding is definitely a concern. The faculty have very little say in how the budget is allocated or even how the budget is created. And we do need to rely on our advocates who are up in the administration, the provost, who has the ear of the president, wherever your budget lines come from. Unfortunately, music gets shortchanged at most traditional colleges, state universities. We're not talking about conservatories, but state universities and liberal arts colleges, even though they will parade out the marching band or the jazz band for every dignitary who comes, they do not see the full value. So I have no answer for funding, but it most definitely plays a huge part in what we are able to do. I said a funny.
Anonymous asked, are there any sources/websites you recommend for a musician that wants to diversify the repertoire that they play?
Well, I had mentioned before the African Diaspora Music Project website, and I think it really is just amdp.com. It's in the, it's one of the attachments that you have. That's a link right there. I would start there because it's orchestral, it's also vocal, and it continues to expand. So if there's something missing, you can always email them and say, how about some band? How about some saxophone? But I would start there.
Institute for Composer Diversity. That's another really big one.
He said the Institute for Composer Diversity.
Hi, how's it going? My question is, I just wrote it down, so I guess what role can people in higher education play in the revision guidelines or accessibility for works? For me personally, I've been to Composer Institute Diversity, but at times, specifically for some of the African composers, it kind of just goes to like Wikipedia sometimes, and I know while we can look at the scores, ideally as musicians we want to perform. So for example, some publishing companies, their submission guidelines are a bit restrictive. So, the lens that they may say like, level 1, level 2, within an African context for a composer, it's sometimes hard to fit that agenda when trying to submit their works.
This has some historical roots to it, because if we're talking about exclusion, then you also don't have space for, getting works, for instance, published. So it kind of plays into that politics, that historical politics. But I think Verlag Nu Musik are now, trying to, it's a very good publishing company in German, very legitimate, that it's trying to actually do what we're trying to talk about here, expanding the canon, by also including a series that publishes African art and even diasporan music. And that series is actually managed by Dr. Christoph. So that is one of probably the things that I'm thinking about that would be very helpful for any references.
Hello, I'm Joshua Rhodes, a student at University of Maryland, but also I'm an OB alum, or an OB, I should say. My question is, we've talked about kind of the relationships of faculty, and then a faculty and administration, and then funding. But is there room for students? And in a way that it's not just creating, I think, like tokenization of one student that's doing the meeting and all of that stuff. Also wondering if there are any examples of works that maybe have worked for certain institutions that might not have worked for others and things like that.
I think we all can say something about that.
Yeah, exactly. Let me start by giving you Chaka, for instance, an opera for three chants by Akineuba. That one is very accessible, very interesting score, and it has a very beautiful recording as well. I'll let my colleagues.
So I was just going to say, the last 10 years or so, there has been a movement in higher education to really listen to the students. And they are on committees, they're on search committees. They can sit in on curriculum committee meetings. They do have a voice, but I think it really does depend on each institution and how they are going to kind of extend that opportunity to the students. But I was just thrilled to start seeing that become more and more common. So I think it's most definitely a change for the better, because the more we can hear from our constituents, because that's what you are, the more we can be better informed on what you're dealing with. Whether it's the number of credit hours you have to take or the 0 credit hours for the 12 ensembles you have to take. We need to hear all of that, and now, at least in my experience, the faculty and the administrators are listening.
Yeah, so first of all, it's a great pleasure to see you, Joshua. It's a great, great pleasure to see you. 2 quick things come to mind. One is, Chris, whom I mentioned earlier, he teaches a course called Racial Politics of Classical Music every fall, and one of the assignments he gives his students is write a letter to the dean explaining curricular changes you'd like to see made. So I have ample opportunity. But much more to that. The sort of more substantive one, I would say, we started an African American music minor at Oberlin. It's an interdivisional minor, but that minor really came by way of observing what students already were doing. This wasn't like, ooh, the admin dreamt something. This was looking at what students had been doing for decades, of taking patterns of courses in Africana studies, music theory, musicology, et cetera, and noticing like, this has been here all along, and the actual like behavior of students, and as they chart an intellectual course through the institution. And so that is just one tiny example of really just observing and also listening to what they were saying, which is, these are all here. Why don't you know? And so, decades later, we said, gosh, it's here. But that's just one example among many. But it's a very important point, and one well taken.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being such an engaging audience and participants, and for your wonderful questions. We are at time. Please join me in thanking this incredible panel. You all were wonderful. And if you would like to continue to talk with us and with this panel, we invite you to do so in the lobby. So thank you yet again for spending some time with us this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.